is a tremendous honor and a pleasure to have Professor Roberto Esposito visiting us from Naples, actually from UC Irvine, yes, on his way to UCLA, but he graciously agreed to stop over. I would simply say that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Roberto's work has reshaped the way we think about the political. He's written on many, many things, from Machiavelli to Rousseau to Hannah Arendt, Simone Weil, etc. But above all, probably the so-called trilogy of his works, as it's often referred to, Comunitas, Immunitas, and Bios, have really been perhaps the most important group of works to have come out in the recent period. It's incredibly important and have irreversibly transformed critical discourse and critical theory. So it's a very great honor, and I just want to say that we are additionally honored to have as his official translator, Professor Timothy Campbell from Cornell, who's not only embarrassed. Who's not only an absolutely superb translator, but also a very important thinker of the biopolitical in his own right. So hopefully we'll have a wonderful discussion. And the way it's going to work is Roberto will read his talk in English, and then we will follow that with a period of questions and answers. I hope there are questions. Not manifested. And that's what they got it. Roberto will answer in Italian, and Tim will translate. That's just for comfort and precision. So without any further ado, I introduce to you Professor Roberto Esposito.
Thanks so much, Professor Montag, for this invitation. Thank you for being here. I apologize for my English, my Neapolitan English. So, immunization and violence. In a text dedicated to Kant as interpreter of the Enlightenment, Michel Foucault locates the test of contemporary philosophy in a clear stance. That stance concerns the tact and the acute relation with the present that he calls ontology of the actuality. How are we to understand the phrase? What does it mean to situate philosophy on the point or line in which the present is revealed in the density of its own historical being? Properly speaking, what does an ontology of the actuality means? Above all, the expression alludes to a change in perspective in ourselves. To be in relation ontologically with the present means to think modernity no longer as an epoch between others, but as a stance, a posture, a will to see one's own present as a task. There is in this choice something, let's call it a tension or an impulse, that Foucault calls an ethos, which moves beyond even the Hegelian definition of philosophy as the proper time spent in thought, because such an ethos makes thought the lever that lifts the present out of a linear continuity with time, keeping the present suspended between deciding what we are and what we can become. In the case of Kant, his support of the Enlightenment didn't mean only remaining faithful to certain ideas, affirming the autonomy of man, for instance, but most of all in activating a permanent critique of the present, not abandoning the present in favor of an unattainable utopia, but in inverting the notion of the possible that is contained within the present, making the present the key for a different reading of reality. Such is the task of philosophy as ontology of the actuality. On the level of analysis, locating the difference between what is essential and what is contingent, difference between superficial effect and the profound dynamics that move things, that transform lives and mark existences. We are concerned here with the moment, the critical threshold from which today's news takes on the breath of history. What is present in being is an underlying question on the meaning of what we call today. What does today mean? What essentially characterizes today, the contradictions and potentialities of today? Yet this question doesn't exhaust at all the task of the ontology of the present. The task isn't anything other than the condition for posing another question, which takes the form of a choice and a decision. What in the present does thought need to assume as given, and what else as aim? What other latent possibilities can be released? What part of the present can one align oneself with, for which one takes a risk, on which one places one bets? Thought must not be limited only to describing what is, the lines or force that traverse our age. Rather, thought as to identify in our present the epicenter of a comparison and the conflict between different perspectives that differ and are juxtaposed within which the present is already situated. Thought is always situated on the moving border between inside and outside, between process and event, between the real and the possible. This border, this limit, this front line is the same side occupied by philosophy, philosophy's horizon of meaning and philosophy's contemporary destiny. Over the years, my work has emerged out of this question and this choice. It concerns the attempt, anything but easy, of finding the key words and paradigm around which the coordinates of a certain historical moment can be structured, even if such coordinates are not in a form visible to the naked eye. This is the question with which I began and which I attempt to respond to. What are the conflicts, the traumas, the nightmares, but also the demands, the hopes that characterize our age so profoundly? I have sketched this key word and this general paradigm in the category of immunity and immunization. What do they mean? We all know that in biomedical language, by immunity, one understands a form of exemption or protection that concerns an infection, while in the juridical lexicon, immunity represents a sort of safeguard that makes one untouchable with respect to common law. In both cases, therefore, immunization alludes to a particular situation that keeps someone safe from the risks to which he or she is exposed and to which the entire community is exposed. Here is delineated beforehand that underlying opposition between community and immunity from which my own recent reflections are born. Without lingering over the details of a complex etymological questions, let's say that immunity, or in its Latin formulation, immunitas, emerges as the contrary, as the reverse of community. affirmative meaning, while the other, immunitas, is negative. Thus, where members of a community are characterized by this donated obligation, by this load of care with regard to the other, immunity implies an exemption or repeals such a condition of obligation. Immune is he or she who breaks the circuit of social circulation, placing himself outside of such a circuit. My underlying theses are essentially two. The first is that this immunitary dispositive, this demand of exemption and protection that originally concerned the medical and juridical fields, progressively extends to all sectors and languages of our life, until the immunitary dispositive became the coagulating point, both real and symbolic, of contemporary experience. Certainly, every society has always expressed a demand for self-protection. Every collective asks a radical question about preserving life. Yet, my impression is that only today, with the end of modernity, such a demand becomes the rotating axis around which both the practices and the imaginary of entire civilization are constructed. To get an initial sense of what I mean, simply take a look at the role that immunology, which is to say the science delegated to study and strengthening immunitary systems, has taken, not only with respect to medicine, but also with regard to the social, the juridical, and the ethical, or merely consider what the autoimmunitary deficiency syndrome of AIDS meant in terms of normalization, which is to say the subjection with respect to precise norms related to individual and collective experience, which aren't only hygienic or health related, to not only prophylactic but socio-cultural barriers that the nightmare of the disease set up in all interrelations. If we move from the sphere of infectious disease to that of the social, of immigration, we have even more proof. The fact that the growing flux of immigration is seen, of course utterly mistaken, as one of the major dangers of our societies, shows us, as well from another side, the centrality that the immunitary question has taken on. Wherever new barriers and new checkpoints are set up, new lines of separation appear with respect to something threatening or that appears at a minimum to threaten our biological, social, and environmental identity. It is as if that fear which Elias Canetti singled out as the origin of our modernity in a perverse short circuit between touch, contact, and contagion, has grown more acute. The contact, the relation, the being in common immediately appears as crushed by the risk of contamination. The same can be said for information technologies. Here too, the gravest problem, the very nightmare of all users, is represented by so-called computer viruses, not just in our small computers, but in the massive computers that regulate and control financial, political, and military relations on a global scale. For some time now, all Western governments have set aside enormous funds for constructing antivirus programs that are capable of immunizing networks from the infiltration by pathogenic agents, even with regard to possible terrorist attack. That today battles as well over the juridical immunity of political figures is at the center of national and international controversies, as it was for Pinochet and Milosevic, but also for many, many others. Berlusconi in Italy is further proof of what I've said. What one fears beyond the specific cases cited here is a weakening of sovereign power of single states, a breaking of the juridical borders of national institutions in favor of some form of international justice that still remains to be built. In short, take up any perspective, what one finds taking place today from the individual body to social body, from the technological body to the political body, is the question of immunity. Every itinerary includes immunity. What matters is to impede, to prevent, to fight with every means available the diffusion and of contagion wherever it occurs. As I said earlier, this preoccupation with self-protection doesn't only belong to our age, but the threshold of knowledge with respect to risk becomes quite different over the course of time, only culminating precisely in our own period. This is due to a series of concurrent causes not far removed from what is called globalization. In the sense that the more humans, but also ideas, languages, technologies communicate and are intertwined, the more is generated a counter-thrust, a demand for a preventive immunization. The recent identification with more local ties and groups can be explained as a sort of immunity rejection of that global contamination that is globalization. The more the self tends to make itself global, which is to say, the harder the self tries to include what is located outside it, the more the self tries to interject every form of negativity, the more negativity is reproduced. It was the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, a wall both real and symbolic, that led to the construction of so many small walls until those walls had transformed and perverted the very idea of community into the form of a fortress under attack. What matters the most, be it on the periphery of world or in the center of metropolis, is blocking an excess of circulation and therefore of potential contamination. From this point of view, the virus has become the general metaphor for all our nightmares. In reality, there was a time in our societies in which fear, at least of the biological sort, was weakened. I am speaking of the 1950s and 1960s, when the optimistic idea spread that antibiotics could rid the world of a number of millennial diseases. It seemed to stay that way until the advent of AIDS. At that moment, the psychological dams collapsed. Symbolic and real viruses appeared again as invincible, true and proper demons capable of penetrating into us and pulling us down into its void of meaning. From then on, the humanitarian demand grows exponentially until it becomes our fundamental measure, the very form that we give to our lives. It is here, nevertheless, that my second thesis is graphic, which is the idea that immunity, which is necessary for protecting our lives, if carried past a certain threshold, winds up negating life. This in the sense that immunity forces life into a sort of cage or armory in which not only our freedom is lost, but also the very meaning of our individual and collective existence, which is to say that circulation, or meaning that I define by the term communities. Here lies the terrible contradiction on which we should focus. What saves individual and collective life is also that which impedes life's development, and indeed what, beyond a certain point, winds up destroying individual and collective life. We could say, in the language of Walter Benjamin himself, that because of the closing of a border, that immunization at high doses is the sacrifice of the living, which is to say of every form of qualified life, to simple survival, the reduction of life to its bare biological layer of bios to zoe. To remain as such, life is forced to give way to an outside power that penetrates and crushes life, to incorporate that nothing that life wishes to avoid, remaining captured by its void of meaning. On the other side, this contradiction, this antinomical connection between protection and negation of life is implicit in the very same procedures of medical immunization. As we know, to vaccinate a patient against a disease, one introduces into the organism a controlled and sustainable portion of this disease. In this case, the medicine consists of the same poison that the organism must protect itself from, such that in order to keep someone alive, one must be given a taste of death. Necropolitics or necroeconomics, like the professor says. It is as if modern immunitary process intensify this contradiction to the extreme. The cure is always given in the form of a little poison. If this immunological practice is related to the working of the social body, the same antinomy, the same counterfactual paradox is registered. To raise continually the threshold of attention of society vis-à-vis a risk, which is what we have grown accustomed for some time now, means blocking the growth of even running backwards toward an earlier state, rather than adjusting the level of protection to the effective nature of the risk. It is as if what is adjusted is the perception of the risk to the growing demand for protection, which is to say risk is artificially created in order to control protection, as insurance companies routinely do. All of this is part of modern experience, but my impression is that we have touched a point, a limit, at which the mechanism of a reciprocal strengthening between risk and insurance, between protection and negation of life, really risks getting out of hand. In order to see what I mean, consider what happens in so-called autoimmune disease, when the immunitary system is so powerful that the system turns against itself, against the same mechanism that should defend it, and so on destroying that system. Certainly, immunitary systems are necessary. No individual or social body can do without them, but when they grow without limit, they wind up pushing the entire organism towards explosion or implosion. This is exactly the trend that took place after the tragic events of September 11, because the war of terrorism and against terrorism is doubly linked with the immunitary paradigm. That war is both the aggravated form of the immunitary paradigm and its moving beyond control, the tragic epilogue of what we can call this immunitarian crisis, in the same sense that René Girard used the expression of sacrificial crisis, when the logic of sacrifice swept past the bands that circumscribe the sacrificial victim, pushing the entire society towards violence as a result. It is then that blood spouts out everywhere and that men literally are torn to pieces. This war appears as originating in the combined pressure of two contrasting and mirror-like humanitarian obsessions, that of Islamic fundamentalism determined to protect the dead, its own presumed religious, ethnic, and cultural purity from contamination by the Western secularization, and that of a West set on excluding the rest of the planet from sharing its own excessive amount of goods. When these two conflicting impulses are brought together without any way of separating them, the entire world is shaken by convulsion that has the characteristic of the most devastating kind of autoimmune disease. An excess of defense with respect to the elements outside the organism is directed toward the organism itself with potentially lethal effects. What exploded along with the Twin Towers was the double system of immunity that until then had held the world together. Let's not lose again the fact that this tragic event took place completely within the triangle of monotheism: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, with its real and symbolic epicenter at Jerusalem. Everything happened there. Everything was unleashed there, within the deadly circle of monotheism, and not within Buddhism or within Hinduism. Why? I would hazard that these civilizations, Islamic, Christian, and Jewish, are in conflict not because they oppose each other, but on the contrary, inasmuch as they are too alike, too tied to each other in their constitutive categories, in their logic of the one, in their syndrome of monotheism, that in the East this takes on the figure of the one God, and in the West of our true God, money, as the absolute value, doesn't detract from the fact that the logic of both is subjected to the same principle of unity, that both want to unify the world on the basis of their point of view. This is what I would define as the metaphysical stakes of this war ahead of oil, territory, and bonds. What paradoxically is at stake in the question is the question of a truth. The battle that gives no quarter between two partial truths whose ambition is to present themselves as global truths, which is precisely that of monotheistic model that has been politicized. On the one hand, the unvarying unvarnished truth of Islamic fundamentalism, whose truth completely coincides with itself, a truth written in the Quran and from there primed for world conquest. On the other hand, the empty truth of Western nihilism, of secularized Christianity, according to which the truth is that truth does not exist, since what matters is only the principle of technological performance, the logic of making money and of total production. These are the two truths, the one completely full, the other completely empty, the one present to itself and the other having withdrawn into the absence of its own truth, but both absolute, exclusive and excluding, that are in conflict with one another, having the very same immunitarian obsession, so as to compare the globality of what reflected back on itself, bursting with itself until the explosion. Political monotheism, the idea that there must correspond to one single God, one single king, and one single realm, expresses the very essence of immunization in its most violent version. The closing down of borders that cannot tolerate anything outside, that exclude the very idea of an outside, that do not admit any sort of extraneousness that might threaten the logic of the one everything. Without wanting to examine the political, social, and cultural responsibility for such a state of affairs, I would like to limit myself to this undeniable fact and trust to auto-immunitary regime that is directed obsessively to identifying what is properly its own, the world, which is to say human life in its totality, doesn't have a great chance for survival. The negative protection of life, strengthened so much that protection is reversed into its own opposite, will wind up destroying not only the enemy outside it, but also its own body. The violence of the interiorization, the abrogation of the outside, of the negative, could be reversed into an absolute exteriorization, into a complete negativity. And so, what can we do to break out of this logical death? What can we do to break out of this logical death? What can we find as the ontology of the actuality we have it, the point at which the present can be inverted towards another possible present? It's difficult to offer a full response to similar questions. What is clear is what we can no longer do. We certainly can't return to the Westphalian model with states acting in concert, states which are completely sovereign with respect to themselves and free with regard to all other states, in a model that dominated the world for at least 500 centuries. In the same way, an equilibrium cannot be reconstructed between blocks facing off against each other as that which dominated the world from the end of the Second World War to the last decades of this last century. Yet, a return to constellation of ethnically defined sites is equally unimaginable. Sites joined together by an absolute relation between territory, blood, and language. The path to take, in my opinion, doesn't pass through the dialectic between global and local, which many contemporary political philosophies refers to, but rather refers to the construction of a new relation between singular and universal. Yet, this in part can be taught only by breaking with the monotheistic paradigm and its constitutively immunitary logic. The question which I here want to pose radically is that of escaping the theological political lexicon, in which despite everything we are still find ourselves in, as is demonstrated by the monotheistic syndrome that I spoke of earlier. And I am not speaking now of the Islamic world, but rather of the West, permitted with political theology in its very secularization, as also Carl Schmitt has already explained to us. Of course, to do so, that is to be free from the theological political lexicon out of which all our categories originate, beginning with that of sovereignty and running to that of juridical person, isn't at all easy. But there is no other way. We can't turn back to the clock to a world that is constituted by pieces that are autonomous in themselves and potentially hostile to what is outside. That would mean standing pat with the destructive and self-destructive logic of immunitas, when we are instead concerned with returning to thinking the reverse of immunitas in the open and the plural form of communitas. The world, which is by now irreversibly united, is not only to be thought but practiced as a unity of difference, as a system of distinction, in which distinction and difference aren't points of resistance or a residue with respect to the process of globalization, but rather its same form. Naturally, I know well enough that transforming this philosophical formula into real practice, into political logic and conceptual language is anything but easy. And yet, we need to find the mode, the forms, the conceptual language for converting the immunitary declensions that all political fundamentalists have adopted in a singular and plural logic in which the differences become precisely that which keep the world united. I believe that the West has in itself the strength, the resources, the cultural means to attempt such an operation of radical conversion, and is notwithstanding the recurring temptation to make the world homologous to only one model, from Heraclitus on, notion that one could be united not by homogeneity, but by difference and diversity, is part of the tradition that the West produces, but never carried out fully. A good part of the West's violent history is marked by the repression and forgetting of such a tradition. The tragic paradox that we are living today lies in the fact that those who have declared war on the West have reproduced and strengthened to the point of paroxysm the very same phobic obsession, the same conviction that community or relation between those who differ cannot exist, which isn't that of mortal autoimmune conflict. In a situation such as this, in which the most destructive tendencies are reflected and doubled in the same road to war, the only possibility is that of breaking the mirror in which the self is reflected without seeing anything but itself. Of breaking the spell, in other words. The great French linguist Émile Benveniste reminds us that the Latin pronoun self, as in the case as well in all its modern derived form, carries within an ancient Indo-European root from which the Latin words sus and sorrow, and the Greek ethos and ethos are derived, meaning relation and ally. From this, Benveniste infers that root is the origin of two distinct semantic lines. The first referring to the individual and private self, expressed by idios, what belongs to the same self, and the second to a larger circle in which most subjects are brought into relation, one with the other. From here, the terms etairos and sodalis, both expressive of a communitarian connection, something that is in common to these that are characterized as such, as precisely happens with the munus of the communitas. From here, then we have two complex relations between the self, which is reflective, and the same self of the same self, and the self which means distinction and difference, like the Latin term self. This demonstrates that at the origin of what we refer to as the self, there is precisely a knot that cannot be undone, of unity and difference, of identity and otherness. Without privileging in any way these etymologies, perhaps in the depths of our linguistic tradition, we can find the keys for inverting, as Foucault said, the line of the present, to free up in the actuality of the present history another possibility, even if it is one that has never yet been experienced. Thank you.
We will now entertain questions. I think there's one.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, you say that we haven't explored that in the Western tradition there's a possibility for unity and difference. I think you referred to Heraclitus, perhaps. Is that correct?
I don't think so.
Oh, maybe I got the pronunciation
No,
wrong.
that's right.
Anyways, so I'm wondering, is it possible, however, that it was in agonism, in the idea of like a political agonism, there was an attempt to try to unite people in difference, and it was precisely in response to that, to the difficulties of agonism, that an immunitarian logic developed, and a globalization, and such things.
Sì. Sì. Secondo lui non abbiamo capito fino in fondo la possibilità nella tradizione dell'Occidente, la possibilità dell'unità e differenza, per cui la sua domanda è: non si può trovare nell'agonismo politico un tentativo di mettere insieme differenza e unità che potrebbe essere legato alla logica comunitaria di cui parli tu, e che legato viene anche alla globalizzazione. Quindi qual è il rapporto più o meno tra questa logica comunitaria e questo senso nell'Occidente di un agonismo politico?
Ma grazie. Nel mio lavoro io ho cercato di guardare la logica dell'immunità in una maniera capovolta rispetto al modo in cui l'immunità è stata sempre considerata. Anche dal punto di vista medico-biologico, il nostro sistema immunitario può essere rappresentato in due modi differenti: o come una barriera di difesa e di attacco contro gli agenti esterni, oppure come un filtro di relazione che ci mette in rapporto con l'ambiente. Fermo?
Sì. So thank you. In my work, I've tried to look at an immunitary logic in a way that's kind of reversed or turned inside out, and I've done that by considering the immunitary system from a medical point of view. In that sense, that the immunitary system could be seen in two ways, both as a barrier of defense, as a way of an attacking of the outside, but also as a way of interrelating with the outside.
Sì, come tutti sappiamo, il nostro sistema immunitario oggi consente i trapianti d'organo e consente soprattutto quello straordinario fatto che è la gravidanza nelle donne. La gravidanza nelle donne è consentita proprio dal loro sistema immunitario, che è capace di non respingere in corpo estraneo il feto, ma di custodirlo al contrario. Ecco, se in questo caso la politica potesse ispirarsi alla logica della vita, e allora potremmo immaginare un rapporto diverso tra unità e differenza nel mondo.
So as you know, our immunitary system today allows us to have transplants. And also and in addition to that, there's also the really extraordinary fact of pregnancy in women. It's thanks to the immunitary system in women during pregnancy that doesn't reject the fetus, but also protects it as kind of a custodian of it. In this sense, the political could aspire to this logic of life. If it could do that, then we could begin to imagine a different relation between unity and difference in the world.
Un ultimo punto. Naturalmente, non potendo parlare inglese, sono costretto a ridurre al minimo le mie risposte, ma l'idea di una biopolitica affermativa nasce proprio da questa idea che non sia sempre la politica a dover modellare la vita, ma che possa a volte essere anche la vita intesa come sistema biologico a costituire un punto di rovesciamento dell'agire politico.
Ripetere l'ultimo pezzo?
Sì.
Come sistema biologico.
Tutti quanti immaginiamo che la politica debba cambiare la vita. Possiamo anche immaginare il contrario, che cioè la logica della vita, intesa nel suo senso più ampio, possa costituire un esempio per trasformare la politica. È una tradizione molto presente al professor Montag, tra Candiena, Macheret, no? Questo giocare la vita in questo modo.
So, one final point. Since I'm not speaking in English, I'm trying to reduce my answers really to in a compact fashion. The idea of biopolitical and affirmative biopolitics is born from this idea, not that the political is only about modulating life, but can also sometimes, and here we understand life as a biological system, could be a way of being a custodian of it. We imagine that the political can change life, but we can also imagine an opposite or contrary of that. That the logic of life, understood in a larger sense, could provide an example of how to change life. And here he cites a
change of politics.
A change of politics. Sorry, a change of politics. Let me say that again. So we can imagine a contrary, that the logic of life, understood in a larger sense, could provide an example of a way of changing politics. And Professor Montag has spoken about this on numerous occasions.
I guess I'm wondering, well, you know, you talked about 9/11 a lot and that whole thing. And I was wondering, they're trying to build an Islamic center where the World Trade Center was, and I was wondering how that affects biopolitics, or how it might change the discourse of biopolitics, and what that might say as like a form of, I guess, vaccinating our community as, well, I'm from Manhattan, so I'm like really interested in that, like how that affects like the community of Manhattan and then like on a greater scale, like the country as a whole.
La domanda
Sì, ha parlato dell'11 settembre e ultimamente stanno cercando, c'è questa idea di costruire un centro islamico vicino alle rovine, diciamo, della Torre Gemelli, no? E lei voleva sapere se, che cosa pensi tu, cioè come potrebbe cambiare il discorso biopolitico questa idea di costruire così vicino questo centro islamico, cioè lei vede in questo un modo per vaccinare la comunità, cioè, lei è di Manhattan e a lei interessa tantissimo pensare come potrebbe essere letta questa idea di questo centro islamico nella comunità di Manhattan, ma anche per il paese, gli Stati Uniti.
Sì, anche in Italia ho seguito questa vicenda di quel predicatore che voleva bruciare il Corano, no? A proposito di questa. Ma io personalmente penso che ogni tipo di contaminazione tra culture, tra religioni, tra modi di vita sia in sé un fatto positivo, che proprio nella ferita gravissima di Manhattan possa esserci un simbolo della religione islamica mi pare un segno del fatto che in gioco non c'è la questione di uno scontro tra religioni o uno scontro tra civiltà, e che la civiltà islamica non coincide con il terrorismo fondamentalista. Non so la posizione di Obama su questo punto, che non lo so.
Lo dico io. Obama ha detto che lui non vuole pronunciarsi, però comunque cosa decidono loro, per lui è una cosa da fare. Basta.
Sì, sì.
So in Italy, so I followed some of this. I've also the news of this question of the center, but also of those that the preacher in Florida, I think it was, who wanted to burn the Quran. So for me, every type of contamination between cultures, religions, modes of life is positive. So
It's possible and positive.
it's possible and positive. In the terrible wound of Manhattan after that is 9/11, one could see in the symbol of the Islamic Center, it could be a sign of not of war between religions or between civilizations. It's a way of saying that Islamic civilization doesn't have to overlap with terrorism, and it doesn't overlap. And then he asked me what President Obama's views on the center were, and I told him I thought they were, which is that he hasn't really said a lot, but the things that he has said are positive. I think that's right.
Vacillated.
Sorry?
He vacillated.
He vacillated a bit, yes.
Come?
Cioè, ha detto una cosa, però non si è pronunciato veramente in modo forte.
Ma sì, perché anch'io credo non debba essere una decisione del Presidente della Repubblica Americana, è una decisione che va lasciata alle comunità locali.
So he agrees with President Obama that such a decision is not really in the purview of the President of the Republic, but is best left to the local authorities.
Sì.
I guess this is more of a clarification question. But I was wondering, so immunity's relation to negation is that one wants to protect oneself or subsume negation, then what is the subject of an authentic community's relation to negation? Is it more of like a simultaneous holding of protection and openness, or is it more of like in keeping with like Bataille's notion of heterology, where one takes something in and lets it change oneself from the inside out?
Vorrei capire il rapporto tra l'immunità.
Clarification, if immunity, scusa, se l'immunità, sometimes I forget what management. So, se l'immunità coinvolge una relazione alla negazione, cioè di proteggere, quale potrebbe essere un rapporto autentico alla negazione? Cioè, potrebbe essere un modo simultaneo di tenere la negazione o più verso Bataille, cioè che uno prende qualcosa dentro e quello cambia da dentro la comunità.
Non mi è detto chiaro.
Dimmi. Cioè, secondo me, sorry, maybe clarification. So, you're asking, what kind of relation can there be in an authentic community with negation?
Yeah, so immunity's relation to negation is merely a protection or a subsuming of the negation into, homogeneity. Then what is an authentic community versus immunity's relation to negation?
Lei dice che c'è quale potrebbe essere una comunità autentica e il suo rapporto con il negativo. Esatto.
Ma è un tema di cui abbiamo parlato un po' a Cornella nel nostro convegno, no? Il rapporto per esempio alla posizione di Negri e Hart, che immaginano che il comune debba avere solo un rapporto con l'affermazione, con l'espansione della vita, diciamo, l'amore. No, io sono convinto che la comunità debba avere un rapporto con il negativo e debba avere un rapporto con il negativo attraverso il conflitto, attraverso l'idea, il paradigma di conflitto, cioè la comunità non può essere un tutt'uno indifferenziato, deve essere oggetto di prospettive non soltanto diverse, ma a volte anche politicamente in conflitto tra di loro. Io sono stato formato sulla filosofia di Machiavelli e quindi conosco l'importanza del conflitto contro l'idea obesiana di neutralizzazione. You also studied this one. E quindi il rapporto tra comunità e negativo, secondo me, passa per una dinamica conflittuale, che non soltanto è possibile, ma è produttiva e necessaria, diciamo.
Possibile e anche produttiva.
Sì.
So we spoke about this last week at a conference at Cornell, and there what came up was a comparison with how Hart and Negri see this. They imagine that a community has to have only a relation with affirmation, with an affirmative expansion, with the politics of love. I'm convinced, rather, that the community has to have a relation with the negative, and it has to have a relation with negation. And here, negation needs to be understood with the idea and the paradigm of conflict. The community cannot be all one. It cannot be undifferentiated. It has to be the object of different perspectives and political perspectives that are in conflict. My own formation in Italy involves Machiavelli, and so I know from Machiavelli the importance of conflict and not neutralizing conflict. The relation between community and the negative passes through a relation with the negative. This relation is not only possible, but it is productive.
Il libro forse più bello su Machiavelli è quello di Althusser, veramente bello.
Professor Esposito, così posso anche leggere. Professor Esposito says that one of the most beautiful, important books he's read on Machiavelli is autoriserve to Machiavelli, and Professor Montag say absolutely agrees.
It seems to me that one of the most compelling examples of the kind of analysis that you advocate is, in fact, that of Hegel, not in the Philosophie des Rechts, but in the Phenomenology of Spirit, where there's a very intricate relationship between what you would call the immunitary and community. Okay? I'm thinking in particular of Hegel's reading of Adam Smith, where in fact the very immunitary impulse, which would declare one exempt from onus officium donum, okay, according to your analysis, would in fact be, through negation, the very possibility of a genuine community. That in a certain way, without the subjects knowing, their very refusal of community and the kind of immunitary logic that could be taken very far, not to violence necessarily, but forms of exemption, is actually, at least in a certain sense, the most powerful way of producing something like a community. And I bring this up not, I'm very interested in your discussion of Hegel, immunità, for example. But I think in our world, that's a very powerful model. And I'm thinking particularly of the idea of the market, of the civilizing and socializing effects of the market and the economy. So how would you distinguish what you're proposing, or would you see a relationship between what you're proposing and the Hegelian model, or would you reject it and
Che rapporto c'entra il mio discorso, il discorso hegeliano?
Sì, soprattutto quest'idea. Allora, secondo lui uno degli esempi più importanti dell'analisi che ha fatto e riguarda Hegel, e non quell'Hegel della filosofia del diritto, eccetera, ma quello esatto. E qui lì pensa a Hegel, letto un rapporto con Adam Smith, in cui l'impulso dell'immunità potrebbe essere legato a questa idea di una negazione della possibilità di una comunità autentica, come diceva lei. Cioè, uno potrebbe, cioè il soggetto, anche se vuole rifiutare la comunità, questo potrebbe essere anche un modo per produrre la comunità. E quindi lui dice che nel nostro mondo questo potrebbe essere un modo anche importante per legare all'idea del mercato come un modo per civilizzare e socializzare. Quindi come si può distinguere quello che dici tu, Humanitas, da quel modello hegeliano che in un certo senso tu non sei d'accordo.
Can I add one? No, because I think you're answering my own question. But no, I think what you just said about how we understand negation and negativity is absolutely critical, because there is a distinction between the Hegelian understanding of negativity on the one side and what we might think of as the Machiavellian idea of negativity as conflict rather than a sort of absence which results in the resolution of conflict. And maybe that's the beginning of it.
Lui dice che c'è un rapporto tra Machiavelli e Roberto.
Sì, no, lui dice che magari una risposta potrebbe essere la differenza tra la negazione in Hegel con la negazione, l'idea del conflitto e negazione in Machiavelli. Questa potrebbe essere una spiegazione del
Ma sì, naturalmente, diciamo intanto, proprio nella fenomenologia dello spirito c'è la dialettica servo-padrone, che in qualche modo può richiamare la dialettica in Machiavelli tra popolo
popolari e nobili, no? Quindi c'è qui un certo senso la stessa idea. Naturalmente poi Hegel va in un'altra direzione. Io credo che quello che sia importante è il rapporto e la concezione di Hegel della società civile, quindi il rapporto tra politica ed economia. E come dicevo prima, l'importante è che l'economia non assuma la funzione, l'antica funzione sovrana, nel senso di lasciar morire, no? Questo è un tema del Cosange, del stesso Formico. Cioè, mentre la funzione sovrana era quella di far morire, diritto alla morte, a partire da Smith l'economia diventa il canale di fare vivere attraverso il lasciar morire di una grande parte di persone. Tutto questo non c'è nel modello di Hegel, no? Credo che questo è un po', sicuramente bisognerebbe parlare molto di più e pensarci molto di più.
So yeah, sure. Let's just draw our attention to the fact that in phenomenology of spirit, there's a dialectic in Hegel between the master and slave, which in some way recalls or reminds us of the dialectic, I want to call it that, in Machiavelli between the popolari and the nobili. In that sense, they might have something in common. But Hegel goes in another direction. I believe what is important in Hegel's conception of civil society are the elements of the political and economic. And the important thing there is that the economic doesn't take on the ancient function of sovereignty, not to let die. And of course, this is the theme of your essay on economics. While the sovereign function was to make die, from Smith on, the economy becomes the channel that makes life through the letting die of a great number of people in society. That isn't in Hegel, or at least I don't see it, but we would have to think a lot more about this.
Posso fare una domanda verso il monte?
Can I ask you a question?
Cioè, vorrei capire se lui è d'accordo con la tesi di Agamben che l'economia, il dispositivo economico ha una forte radice teorica. Est-ce que tu es d'accord avec cette interprétation théologique de l'économie?
So he's asking him if Professor Montag agrees with Giorgio Agamben that the economy, the dispositif, the apparatus of the economy, has a very strong theological root or origin.
Yes. I think the idea of providencia
Sì.
is extremely important for Smith, for example. Physiocrat. Now that we've had a nice discussion, there must be other questions, aren't there? Yes.
First, I want to say thank you for coming to our school. I think it's really awesome having someone on the cutting edge of theory, I guess, come to our school and teach us. Agamben has the idea of homo soccer, the one, in Montag's words, who must be killed with impunity, who is outside of the community. I want to ask, is immunity, two questions actually, is immunity, or does immunity reduce our lives or the society to homo soccer, and what is the relation of the sovereign to community and immunity?
Il rapporto tra la sovranità e la dialettica tra comunità e immunità.
Quella è la seconda domanda. La prima è come si può metterci l'idea dell'uomo saggio, che uno può ammazzare questo qua senza essere punito, no? Cioè, è vero che l'immunità, secondo te, potrebbe ridurre le nostre vite a uno saggio, secondo te? Seconda è la reazione, secondo te, tra la sovranità e immunità e la sovranità e comunità.
Ma l'immunità, il paradigma immunitario può ridurre tutte le nostre vite a uno sacero, ma questo potrebbe accadere, secondo me, solamente se il paradigma immunitario rompesse ogni rapporto con la comunità, cioè se diventasse un paradigma autoimmunitario, no? Questo per esempio in qualche modo sembrò accadere alla fine della seconda guerra mondiale, quando Hitler dette l'ordine di suicidarsi alla società tedesca, no? Quello era proprio il passaggio in cui il paradigma immunitario diventava assolutamente una malattia autoimmune. Mi fermo qui.
So, yes, immunity can reduce us to homosatria, but it can only happen if the paradigm of immunity or immunization breaks all of its relations to community, and in that sense it becomes an autoimmunity. This seems to happen at the end of the Second World War when Hitler gives the order to all of German society to kill itself. That would appear to involve the passage from an immunitary paradigm to an autoimmunitary illness.
Io non sono però d'accordo con la tesi di Agamben quando identifica totalmente sovranità e biopolitica in un quadro, diciamo, ontologico e metafisico molto suggestivo, ma che perde ogni contatto con la successione storica. Da questo punto di vista seguo Foucault, secondo cui la biopolitica non è più, l'ordine biopolitico non è più l'ordine sovrano. E quindi la categoria di immunità io la leggo più alla biopolitica che al regime sovrano, perché nasce fondamentalmente all'origine della modernità, non prima.
Scusa, l'ultimo pezzo non...
Sì, vabbè,
okay. I'm not in agreement with Agamben's thesis when he identifies sovereignty and biopolitics in a context that, sure, it's suggestive both ontologically and metaphysically, but it loses all of its contact with history and the events of history.
Sì, Agamben lavora su un paradigma heideggeriano e benjaminiano fondamentalmente, no? Mentre invece la tesi di Foucault, con cui io concordo, è che la biopolitica nasca dentro la modernità, quindi non coincida con tutta la storia del politico.
Agamben's work here is really dedicated to, or is influenced by Heidegger and Benjamin, and I prefer rather the Foucault's thesis, with which I agree wholeheartedly, which is that biopolitics is born from modernity, but that doesn't coincide with the entire history of the political, which is in fact what characterizes Agamben's reading of the biopolitical, or the political film.
You were mentioning earlier about how sort of the behavior of Nazi Germany went from immunity to autoimmunity in 1945 when Hitler ordered German society to kill itself, basically. So I was thinking about your idea of immunity as sort of a the defining axis, you said, of geopolitics in relation to the modern war on terror, like you said. For example, the other day, I was listening to a CIA officer who said that the recent plots to blow up various targets in Europe by some terrorist group were motivated by a sort of tribal feud mindset that they had against the West as a result of airstrikes in Pakistan. So that got me thinking that the sort of West's desire to protect itself from terrorism is analogous to like a patient who has an infection and their fever, which is intended to defeat the infection, ultimately ends up killing their brain cells and killing the patient. So I was wondering, I guess then, at what point does at what point does the immune behavior characterize or go to autoimmune? Or like, at what point does the immune behavior just kill the patient if the patient is a nation?
Allora, hai parlato di questo passaggio nella società tedesca dall'immunità all'autoimmunità, e io stavo pensando dell'idea dell'immunità e il suo legame con la biopolitica e con il centro del piccolo dell'Italia. Per esempio, l'altro giorno stavo ascoltando un ufficiale della CIA che parlava di questi tentativi in Europa ultimamente dei gruppi terroristici di far esplodere. E lui diceva, lui o lei, non so, ha detto che questo fa parte di una certa modo di pensare che è il risultato di tutte le bombe, tutti gli attacchi che fanno l'Occidente in Pakistan. Allora, lui vuole sapere questi desideri di attaccare non è diverso da un paziente che ha un'infezione e questa infezione porta alla febbre e la febbre ammazza il paziente. Allora, la domanda è: a che punto diventa l'immunità? A che punto diventa l'immunità un'autoimmunità? Cioè, a che punto potrebbe essere l'immunità micidiale per un paziente, se questo paziente è una nazione?
Intanto il tema dell'autoimmunità è stato molto sviluppato da Derrida, proprio a proposito dopo gli eventi dell'11 settembre. Ma non c'è un punto preciso in cui il paradigma immunitario diventa autoimmunitario. Diciamo che il rafforzamento del sistema immunitario che le società contemporanee producono attraverso l'attivazione della paura del rischio determina a un certo punto, come dire, un rovesciamento autoriflessivo che si riflette su se stessi. Ecco, la logica degli attentati terroristici suicidiari, diciamo, autosuicidiari, appartengono sicuramente alla logica dell'autoimmunità, ma anche, per esempio, tutta la prospettiva di Bush, no, delle guerre preventive, anche entravano dentro un orizzonte autoimmunitario, no? E poi quando si sono scontrati questi due sistemi c'è stata un'esplosione.
So the theme of autoimmunity was developed by Jacques Derrida, a series of interviews after September 11. There's no precise point in which immunity becomes autoimmunity. The strengthening of immunity is produced through the activation of the fear of risk or fear, and that determines how immunity might in some way become autoimmunity. So the suicidal attacks belong to autoimmunity, that's clear enough. But, for example, also, you want to think about President Bush and preventive war, that too belongs to the paradigm of autoimmunity. And so when these two systems meet, you have an explosion.
Anche, volevo aggiungere un'altra cosa, anche la crisi economica attuale può essere letta attraverso la logica immunitaria, perché il sistema capitalistico funziona producendo crisi, da sempre, fin dall'inizio. A un certo punto però questo assumere veleno per produrre attraverso la crisi è diventata qualche cosa che tendenzialmente distrugge tutta l'economia capitalistica. Quindi, anche in quello siamo dentro un quadro autoimmunitario, da cui non so se, quando e se l'economia capitalistica si riprenderà veramente.
So he's saying that the recent economic crisis can be read as part of an immunitary logic because the capitalist system, as we know, functions by producing crisis, and it's been that way from the beginning. At a certain point, the capitalist system takes on, assumes within itself poison, and that becomes something that can destroy the entire system, capitalist system. And so that logic is also inside an auto-immunitary paradigm. And who knows at which point that system, that patient, might get better.
The U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki was recently...
I'm sorry, could you... Sorry.
The U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki was recently put on the CIA's capture or kill list, and that decision is being defended in court as a state secret. And the fact that he's a U.S. citizen, do you think that means that the U.S. has taken a further step into an autoimmune response to perceived disease? And do you think that's going to get even worse as the war on terror continues?
Allora, c'è un cittadino americano, I'm sorry,
The name?
yeah,
Anwar al-Awlaki?
al-Awlaki, right. Lui è stato messo su questo elenco di uno che deve essere catturato e anche ammazzato. E lui è un cittadino americano, quindi questo potrebbe essere letto come una risposta a una malattia percepita e quindi potrebbe essere anche letto...
Ma perché doveva essere ammazzato?
Perché lui è un terrorista. Cioè, secondo la... It's because he's considered to be a terrorist,
Yeah,
right?
accused of being a terrorist.
Sì. E quindi qui abbiamo qualcosa contro un cittadino americano, anche se questo qua...
Che un cittadino americano, anche se terrorista, possa essere indicato come l'oggetto di un'uccisione, allora ci riporta veramente alla logica dell'homo sapiens, no? Via Gandhi. Mi pare quasi impossibile immaginare che in America possa accadere una cosa del genere dal punto di vista legale, no? L'istigazione a uccidere qualcuno da parte della gente. E così poi il professore.
The idea that an American citizen can be indicated as being the object of a killing really brings us to Homo Sacer and Giorgio Agamben's work. And it's just hard for me to believe or to imagine that something like this can happen legally in the United States.
So it's kind of a related question actually, but when I think of immunization, I think of the sort of strategic introduction of difference in order to contain that difference. And so if in some sense it's about assimilating a sense of difference to oneself, I wonder what immunity, or maybe there is another word for it, but what some sort of concept would look like from politics of the minor. So
Politics of the
minor.
Of the minor.
So, you know, in a sense, like what happens when it's that kernel of difference. It's from the perspective of the difference that we think. Does that make sense? Not really.
Well, no. I'll translate it and maybe.
Or I
I
can.
can go back to you.
Do you want me to try again with you?
Well, I think I got it. Why don't I try? Lei vuole fare una domanda legata alla domanda prima.
Sì.
Cioè, si può, quando lei pensa dell'immunità, lei pensa di un'introduzione strategica di una differenza in modo da contenere, c'è questa differenza. Cioè, in quale senso? Nel senso di assimilare quello che è differente al sé, cioè potrebbe essere e lei vuole legare quest'idea di questa immunità, un altro concetto, a una politica minore, una politica ben minore. Non ho capito bene cosa
Forse nel senso di Deleuze, di politica.
Sì, esatto. E quindi cosa succede a questo nodo, elemento di differenza, quando viene visto dalla prospettiva proprio dall'elemento che è diverso?
Prima parlavo di questo modo diverso di intendere l'immunità, cioè come filtro di rapporto con l'altro e di trasformazione. Questo è precisamente un tema di Deleuze, cioè quando Deleuze parla del divenire animali o di divenire donna, che cosa intende? Intende che l'identità non si costruisce attraverso, diciamo, una barriera di separazione, ma si costruisce sempre attraverso un'autodecostruzione del sé, no? E solamente se pensata nel suo rapporto con la comunità, l'immunità può diventare appunto un canale di passaggio per la trasformazione del sé. Però bisogna radicalmente cambiare l'idea comune generale dell'immunità come barriera di felicità. Questo sta accadendo in medicina, precisamente.
He's picking up on the politics of the minor, and in relation to the self and the other and the translation of the other. He says this is obviously the theme in Deleuze of the becoming animal, the becoming woman. Deleuze understands identity isn't constructed with a barrier of difference, but also is something that comes is related to a self and auto-construction, self-construction of the self. So therefore, immunity, if it's only thought, if only thought with community, immunitas can become a kind of channel for transforming the self. But in order for that to happen, we have to change the way that we see immunity, not as a barrier, but as something else. And this is happening right now in the field of medicine. There are many kinds of discussions going on about immunity that isn't precisely linked to defense or a barrier. Sì.
Stanno trasformando in Homo sapiens.
He's asking if he's turning into a Homo sapiens. No.
Other questions? Well, thank you very much.